Coming to you from Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. Today I'm sitting down in LARB HQ with two fellows who, let's just say, maybe they don't know everything about Roman Polanski. Nobody does, but even Roman Polanski, I don't think, knows everything about Roman Polanski, but they're experts. They know more about Roman Polanski than I do, and I enjoy a Roman Polanski movie. To my right sits James Greenberg. He is the author of a new book, Roman Polanski, a Retrospective. He's also the editor-in-chief of DGA, the Quarterly of the Directors Guild of America. To my left sits James Morrison, novelist, memoirist, author of, a few years back, the Contemporary Film Directors Series volume on Roman Polanski. He also teaches film and literature and creative writing at Claremont McKenna. Gentlemen, we're here in Los Angeles, and you can't talk about Los Angeles film without mentioning Roman Polanski's Chinatown. We know the place of Chinatown in Los Angeles lore, but what is the place of Chinatown in Polanski's career?
I think it's probably his first or second best film and a masterpiece and one of my personal favorites. I asked Polanski once about it, and a number of times, but I first met him in 1991, and a few years after that, I had been watching him film on the set in Paris, and he was giving me a ride back to town, and I felt comfortable enough to start gushing about Chinatown. And he kind of looked at me and said, "Oh, not so great."
Not so great. He's not a fan. He's not the fan of Chinatown you are.
I understood it. He is, but what I understood about that later was he was more protective of his other children, Fearless Vampire Killers, or some of the other films that had been cast off, and Chinatown didn't need his support and push because it's generally regarded as one of the masterpieces of film for the last 50 years. And but subsequently, I did pin him down, and I think he believes that and ThePianist are his two best films.
He admits Chinatown is good. He just doesn't think it needs his assistance to take flight. It's long since taken flight on its own.
Exactly. He likes to be a little contrary.
James Morrison, where do you see Chinatown in his filmography? What is its role in Roman Polanski's career to date?
It ranks very high, of course, but I can understand his own response to it because I would think of it as being one of his least personal films. It's the one that's most generically pure, you could say. It's a neo-noir that appeared amid a spate of 1970s neo-noirs, so it was actually quite typical of that era of the New Hollywood, though, of course, incomparably better than almost all of them. But if you think of it in relation to his other sort of genre experiments, including The Fearless Vampire Killers, which is one of his most personal films, it is polished and it's impeccable in its technique. It's slick. And, I think he values all of those things. But in the films of his that are most personal to him, from the vantage point of looking at his career in overview, there is usually a kind of counterweight to those qualities of polish and slickness. And of course, some of the most personal films don't have those qualities at all. And so in a way, it may be one of his least complex films to talk about, at least in terms of its position within his career as a whole.
One thing I would add to that is that it was not a film that he wanted to do initially. He was in Rome and wasn't anxious to come back to the States to do it. And he was contacted by Nicholson and Robert Evans, and they had this material for him. And he realized that material that good didn't come along that often. So, but it was not in that sense, it was not a personal project. I would argue that he made it personal, but it wasn't a project that he, like some of his others, that he had been developing for many years.
What is the mark of a personal Roman Polanski project? What qualities stand out as identifying a film as one very close to his heart?
Well, we could pick out any number of films. I think of Cul-de-sac, for instance, which is close to his heart. His feeling about that is that it was specifically a film. It couldn't be done in any other medium. It couldn't be a play. It couldn't be a story. It was perfectly cinematic, and it was a project that he worked on with his frequent collaborator, Gerard Brock. They did something like 10 films together. And it was the film that he wrote after A Knife in the Water and that he wanted to do next and was unable to do until after he had some success with Repulsion. So I think you see some of the classic Polanski tropes in Cul-de-sac, the claustrophobia, the isolation, the antagonism between the couples, the black humor. That's something that I think gets missed a lot in Polanski, is that all the films are humorous, at least to him, and sometimes he thought the Tenant was a hoot, and when he talks about it, he said, when the character jumps out of their window the second time. Or it jumps off the first time, doesn't kill himself, and goes back up. He said, "Oh, wasn't that hilarious?" So again, it's a very black sense of humor, and sometimes it's so black that people don't pick it up as being funny.
On the same page as his diehard fans, but not necessarily the wider public as far as the sensibility goes. You mentioned humor, but does this extend to the other qualities? A Roman Polanski film is distinctive and very appealing to someone who enjoys Roman Polanski movies, but perhaps in an off-putting way to other people?
Well, yes, he hasn't had that many, breakout hits. That I guess ThePianist was somewhat successful, but offhand, I couldn't say what his highest grossing film was. Maybe you know.
I don't offhand.
Yeah.
Maybe for the making allowances for inflation, Chinatown.
Yeah.
Chinatown. But I would agree that with everything James has said, and just add that it's a kind of a quality of excruciation that makes a Polanski film, I think, very close to his own heart, and at the same time, these countercurrents that appear in the films. I think the films that are least critically valued are often among the ones that Polanski himself values the most. And one of the reasons for that is because he values elements of the unexpected, strange turns, something a little off in some of the tonalities. And, he really does invite the viewer to adopt a position of pleasure in relation to excruciating materials. For example, it's very hard to imagine an audience not groaning in that scene where Trelkovsky in The Tenant goes back up to the balcony to jump out a second time, as if the first time were not enough. But that sort of pushing of the threshold of how far you can go, really, is something that I associate with Polanski's personal films.
When the Tenant came out, it played at Cannes, and it was his first film after Chinatown. So he was riding a wave, And the film was just ruthlessly panned at Cannes, much to everyone's disappointment. He said afterwards they all went off to Saint-Tropez and got drunk. But I think he was surprised and again very, very disappointed that people didn't get the film. And it's not an easy film to get, and I think that's true of many of his pictures, and if not certainly elements in them. They don't coddle an audience. He has no time and patience for that, either in person or in his movies.
You mentioned, James Morrison, this inverse relationship between the critics and Polanski on his own filmography. He likes the ones the critics don't, and vice versa. And I would think a critic who sees 500 movies a year would long to see the surprises and askew turns a Polanski film would make, but it doesn't play so well with them.
You would think that, wouldn't you? Yes. Which makes it quite remarkable that at least in the United States, critical taste tends to be so straight-laced. I guess I would say that in the last 20 years, in large part, I think due to Polanski wouldn't like this characterization, but maybe a certain cultish ambience about some of his most interesting and complicated films has become a little bit more of a mainstream taste. So that a film like The Ninth Gate divides critics very vehemently. Right. There are those who see it as being very much a kind of personal film, as it were, and those who simply think it's bad. You know?
Is that what happened?
I'm in the latter category.
You think it's bad? The Ninth Gate is, I'm of a different generation than a lot of Polanski fans, so The Ninth Gate was the first one I saw theatrically. Not the first Polanski film I saw, but the first one where I could go and say, I'm watching a Roman Polanski film in a theater. I don't remember disliking it, but yeah, let's see. Is that the bottom of the Polanski barrel for you, James Greenberg?
I have to check his filmography here. It's close.
Why is it so? Why does it not show off his advantages? What is unsuited about this film?
I think sometimes again, that's a film that he thought was hilarious or at least humorous, and he said he didn't think he got the performance he wanted from Johnny Depp, that he didn't understand the humor in the character. He said he was a fine actor, but he didn't give him the character that he wanted. There's always something interesting in a Polanski film. The staging and the setup and the character interaction and the costumes, he's just a masterful filmmaker. So there's always something to watch. There's always scenes to watch. In terms of The Ninth Gate, I think the story lets him down. I think it's just so over the top and ridiculous in a way. The beginning part is kind of a tight thriller. As it's set up, the framework is set up. Johnny Depp's a rare book dealer, and he comes upon a volume that may be the key to making Satan manifest himself. And he goes off on a hunt, and the hunt just becomes increasingly a Byzantina. In the end, it just explodes in not one but two, I think three fires at the end. He likes the special effects. Yes. He was particularly happy with being able to play with that, but I thought it really kind of unravels as it goes along.
Yes, I think it's interesting to look at in terms of the first film in which he's really working with digital technologies. And, he's always been very, very interested in technique. His films fall very much in line, though they're usually a little more advanced in terms of their use of available technologies of the day. One thinks, for example, of the uses of sound in Rosemary's Baby, which are really path-breaking in the new Hollywood. the easeful incorporation of these sort of smooth and silky digital effects in The Ninth Gate is really dazzling. And it's certainly true that one could hope for more in the narrative realm. but it's a campy film, so it's in line with the fearless vampire killers and pirates, and has what's bad and what's good about that kind of commitment to an aesthetic, right?
I agree. I think that's what Polanski was shooting for, and didn't quite pull off. But I think he was viewing it as a sort of parody, a sort of satire, as fearless vampire killers. But I don't think it reaches that. I don't think it's apparent what he's up to.
Now, we've mentioned movies from all over his filmography, all over Polanski's filmography, and he's, of course, still making them today, still hard at work. But I want to get a sense of how you both approached his filmography for your books. And I'll start with you, James Morrison. Writing your contemporary film director's volume on him, how did you, knowing you had to get a grasp on all his movies to date for that book, how did you go about it?
Well, I would like to begin by saying what is remarkable about James Greenberg's book, which is a magnificent production that every admirer of Polanski must get immediately. You just won't believe the riches of it. So that films that in most critical accountings are, shall we say, minimized, receive a really full treatment. All of the films are treated, and we get a lot of background material. In my own, the lesser efforts in my own book, which is a critical treatment of the work of Polanski, what I take to be the lesser efforts, such as Pirates and Frantic and The Ninth Gate, are spoken of very, very briefly. So
you can't say anything nice. Don't say anything at all.
That was the philosophy that was being brought to bear. And I sort of assume a certain knowledge after an initial overview of Polanski's work. So it's really written for a Polanski fan. And so I'm not really doing a kind of chronological trek through his work, rather trying to parse certain kinds of themes and ideas and motifs that recur, and talking about films as they happen to come up based on those issues.
And we have, James Greenberg, a couple copies of your lush volume, Roman Polanski, Retrospective. Tell me your approach then, given that each book has to approach the filmography in a new way. You've written the newest book on Polanski. What direction do you want to take?
I should add, it's also the only book that he's ever participated with.
Yes, important to note. None of them have had that before yours.
No, and it wasn't easy to come by.
Why do you think it wasn't easy to come by? Why do you think he's been hesitant to cooperate before?
I think so much has been written about him, so much about his personal life, that he regards it as a snowball. One thing is written, and then someone else picks it up, and it continues, and whether it's true or not, it becomes the gospel. And I think he's kind of sick of it, or he certainly has no reason to talk about it. And when I approached him, and I interviewed him a number of times over the years, I said, Roman, this is going to be a book about your movies. And he said, okay, I'll think about it.
He'd heard that one before, perhaps?
He was leery that a publisher would really want to do a book just about his work. And I assured him over a period of time that, yes, we're just going to deal with the work. And eventually he said, I remember I was talking to him and he said, okay. And it was just, and then once he agreed to do it, he was very generous with his time and very cooperative. And in fact, I was there last August, was the last time I interviewed him in person. He allowed me to go through his photo archives, which was quite a thrill. It's like a closet in your house with a bunch of boxes, except these boxes are are labeled Chinatown, cul-de-sac, repulsion, and student days. There's I was literally pouring through childhood pictures and relatives. He didn't even know who they were, and it was, as I said, thrilling. And I was able to discover some real things I hadn't seen before.
How much does the process of trying to really focus as much as you can on the work and only the work, how different does that already make your book from previous books? I mean, does ignoring, I don't know, were you ignoring the personal life? Can you ignore the personal life? Because these leak in no matter who the artist.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I think in any artist, you have to consider the personal life and what's informed their sensibility and what's created their artistic sensibility, their aesthetics. And Polanski's no different than that. Plus, which he has this fabulous, fabulous, not as in great, but just this oversized life that you couldn't create or imagine if you wanted to. And I think most people who are listening to this know some of the details. But it's impossible not to talk about some of the events, the Manson killings and the assault in the sexual assault that keeps him out of this country to this day. As I was going into the book, I was wondering, well, I have to mention them. I have to acknowledge them. I can't pretend that they're not there. It's an elephant in the room. You can't not say that these things happened. So I dispensed with it early on in the introduction, in the beginning part of the book, and I said, he has had an incredible life, and yes, it makes a remarkable story, but it's not what we're dealing with here. This is a book about his movies. And I add to that I don't hesitate to make biographical connections to his films where they're necessary. And I think there's a temptation to overdo that. And I don't know what the line is to emphasizing his biography. And in some films, it's quite obvious. The Pianist, he's open about talking about that. The story is not his, but the incidents that he dramatizes are right out of his life. Some of the brutality he witnessed with his father in the Krakow ghetto, and some of the staging is right out of his memory.
He clearly and says he used pieces of his life. There's no hiding of anything here. There's no embedding of elements of his life. He used them as a creator would.
Yeah, I mean, and he waited. I think in terms of doing The Pianist, I think it was inevitable that he was going to do a Holocaust project, and I think he knew that it was inevitable he was going to do a Holocaust project. It was just a question of finding the right material and the right time in his life. Some years before, he had been offered Schindler's List by Spielberg to see if he wanted to direct it. And he turned it down for a couple of reasons. One, it was the Krakow ghetto, and it was too close to home, and it was just too emotional for him to do. And also, he wasn't ready to do it. And then he found the Spielman memoir, and he realized this was the material. Again, this was not a story that came along very often, and now was the time to do the Holocaust story. But there are many events in the film that are out of his history. I think when Spielman escapes and his family's going off to the camp, and a guard tells him, get out of here, run away. I think that happened to Polanski. And a killing on the street where an SS just takes out a gun and executes a woman for no apparent reason. He had witnessed that. So these things are present.
James Morrison, you mentioned earlier that the way that you drew out themes in your book on Polanski, and given some of the themes people do draw out from Polanski's work, the paranoia, the hauntedness you can find in a lot of them. I mean, you look at his life, it's almost like you're being dared to draw parallels, aren't you?
Well, like James' book, mine is on Polanski's work, and there's barely a mention of biographical details. On the other hand, there is a streak of perversity that comes through in interviews with Polanski that suggests that there is almost some literal kind of dare, because the moment any kind of biographical approach to his work is broached, of course, he either ends the interview in many cases, or becomes very, very agitated.
Bristles at it, I think.
So but take it from experience. This is true. As you can say, he bristles at it as well.
Well, I think there are places he'll go, and there are places he won't go. And if he doesn't want to go there, he'll usually make a joke and deflect it. He's quite playful. And people think that might have this image of him as being serious and dark, and in real life, he's quite charming and loves to tell stories and jokes, elaborate sometimes. And if it's a question he doesn't want to answer, he'll, like any other experienced director who's been interviewed a lot, or if it's something he doesn't want to talk about, he's skilled in deflecting it.
Well, even so, we've been talking about his work in terms of the question of whether particular films are, quote, personal or not, unquote. But I don't think that we mean anything having to do with the biographical elements of his life, but rather a kind of sensibility that emerges and remains consistent from film to film. It's still the case, however, that my own sense of what Polanski is most interested in thematically has to do with questions of domination and subjugation. Almost all of the films are about a kind of power relation, a power struggle, and what makes them intricate and complex is that while the emotional investments that you feel in the film on the part of the filmmaker are almost entirely with the victim in these encounters, it's not always that clear. So the emotional investments are very, very are often very hard to pin down, and they shift. So once one realizes what is the case, that almost all of Polanski's films concern in some literal way rape scenes, then it doesn't make me necessarily want to rush back to Polanski's life and feel as if I've somehow got the key to the case that keeps him out of the United States. But it does make me see some additional level to the work.
It's facile to reduce it to a one-on-one relationship, but it is something that's there, and something that I think gives the work some resonance in some ways.
When did Polanski's work begin resonating with you, James Greenberg? When did you first realize this was a director that had created a cinematic world you wanted to go deeper into?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about it. when he piqued my cinematic imagination. And I can't remember the first film of his that I saw. I do remember seeing Chinatown when it came out, and walking out of the theater on a hot summer night and just being, the expression goes, blown away by it. I was disoriented the way that you rarely are in coming out of movies anymore. That it just something about your world shifted, or some worldview was enforced, or something that you hadn't expected. I mean, the fatalism and the negativity of it was just startling. I think even at that time, when it was kind of a nihilistic era, when it came out in 74, but Polanski takes it to I think new extremes, and that was a crux of his argument with Robert Towne about the screenplay. The original Towne screenplay, Evelyn Mulray kills her father, kills Noah Cross. She presumably gets off with some light jail time, and given the territory, it's a relatively happy ending. And Polanski knew that that was wrong. He knew it was wrong for the material, and if it was going to be true to the events and the characters, there had to be that kind of ending where the bad guys get off. So no bad deed goes punished.
You mentioned before, James Morrison, the sense of the viewer's sympathies shifting, your allegiance is shifting, not quite knowing where to put your sympathies ultimately in a Roman Polanski movie. This disorientation that you mentioned, James Greenberg, sounds a little bit, is this all of a piece, this disorientation where you're just not sure where to throw your lot in a Polanski movie?
Well, let's take an example. Let's take the example of Rosemary's Baby, which is my favorite Polanski film, and the first one that I saw on television as a kid. I'd been forbidden to see it because it was run with a disclaimer that children should not watch it. And but I sneaked into a back room and watched it, and was a kid, but sensed that the very intense sympathy with the violation of the character of Rosemary was somewhat complicated by what is an essentially comic treatment of the material. James Greenberg is of course absolutely right to suggest that there is this sort of core of a comic sensibility at work in Polanski. So does this subvert or undermine the intensity of sympathy that the film appears to be expressing with the character of Rosemary, a painfully vulnerable character? I don't think it does, but it certainly complicates it. And I think a very similar kind of dynamic is visible in most of Polanski's films, with perhaps the exceptions of Repulsion and Tess. Repulsion seems to me to be the Polanski film that has the least comic shading alongside of Tess. But they both have what many critics might see as sort of incongruous comic set pieces. The scenes in the bar, for example, in Repulsion, and the scene with the housekeeper near the end of Tess, and so on.
There's always a sense of absurdity that he's picked up from, very influenced, I think, by Beckett, very influeed by theater of the absurd, the surrealists, and I think there's always that kind of unexpected scene, even in a film like Repulsion, which essentially is not a lot of laughs. I just saw Rosemary's Baby last night. I was showing it at the Cinematheque, and I hadn't seen it on a big screen for many years, and it was just a treat to see how great it looks. And just as an aside, I would say to everyone and to myself, get out to the theaters more and see movies on the big screen.
Yes. It's something you can do here, and indeed there have been many screenings in association with your book, correct? At the Cinematheque Polanski films.
We did 3 nights. We did Tess and Frantic, and last night was Rosemary's Baby and Repulsion, and there was one other, but. Yeah, it's a great opportunity to. I watched Tess in a restored version, and it's when I was doing the book. Mostly, I was watching it on a big screen television, and sometimes even on my computer, which is fine for studying. I'm sure, as James knows. But the experience of watching it with an audience in a theater is how a filmmaker like Polanski sees his work and makes his work. And it's much more immersive.
Do you think that Polanski's films of the 60s, 70s, even a bit later, do they strike audiences the same way now as they did then? Do you think the impact is the same? It may be the same degree of impact. Is it the same kind of impact?
The way I was describing that Chinatown hit me, and this is the mid 70s, and I think it touched a nerve in what was happening in our society, what was happening in our culture. Nowadays, if someone would see it, they might not be as impressed by the nihilism. I think they've seen years of crooked politicians and corrupt public servants and betrayal, and I think the expectation is that things would turn out for the worst, and I think that's something in that you see over and over in Polanski's films is they do turn out for the worst, and he doesn't sugarcoat them for the most part.
You've mentioned the nihilism of Chinatown a few times, and we've put Polanski in the context of the new Hollywood, the late 60s and 70s, which would cluster him with directors like a Robert Altman or a Francis Coppola or a Martin Scorsese emerging then. They all seem to have a kind of a nihilistic bent at that time, did they not? I mean, did Polanski crystallize the nihilism of a broader movement?
I would say that he did, and I would say that his films take on resonance with the years. This, I suppose, could be said of any great director, but what makes Polanski a special case is exactly that quality of a sense in which the worst has already happened.
Right.
I mean,
at least it's over.
well, in a way, I mean, the sense in which the worst has already happened could be understood as one of the things that enables a certain comic treatment. It's kind of at the core of a lot of absurdism. But, take again the case of Rosemary's Baby. The most terrible thing that could happen happens very early in the film. Rosemary is raped by the devil. Yes. No spoilers there. It's early enough that and most people going to the film know that anyway. So what we're watching in the course of the film is essentially the aftermath to the worst that has already happened. And we know it. Rosemary doesn't, but everybody else does, and it's so obvious that Rosemary should know it. That's part of what makes the film so excruciating. That's, again, one of the key features of the movie's the aesthetic experience the movie offers, excruciation, right?
That ought to be a title of a Polanski movie, Excruciation, shouldn't it?
Excruciating.
But, one could say something very similar of a lot of the films. Many of them, in fact, turn on violations that have occurred before the plot begins. Chinatown, for example, has at its core a rape that has occurred well before the narrative commences. The same is true of Death and the Maiden. So I think, in fact, one of the things the New Hollywood did, of course, was to mainstream a kind of darker sensibility than classical Hollywood had. And we've gone further and further with that since the New Hollywood, that is in the 80s and 90s. So, Polanski's films seem probably as current as anyone's from the 60s and 70s, in part because of that sensibility that now seems not that uncommon, though Polanski's version of it remains extremely distinct.
There is a realism that came out of that period of cinema, and that Polanski enhanced his work, enabled him in a sense to do his work. In the course of talking about the book, I've been asked, what would have happened to Polanski if he stayed in America and had been able to work in Hollywood? And of course, it's a tantalizing question. I don't know the answer, but I would say that he might have been chewed up by Hollywood because the kind of movies that he makes, the idiosyncratic and personal films that he was doing in the 60s and his colleagues were doing, they become few and far between. And I think if he had been, his sensibility, what was different than his work from his work from Coppola and Altman was he was European, and specifically East European. And I think that really made a difference in his sensibility and what he brought to it. But had he been continued to work in this country, and it would have been nice if he could have had access to material and done it as he wished to. But I think in a way, being forced to work in Europe kept his vision intact. The films weren't always wonderful, but they were always interesting. And I'm not sure you could say the same thing if he had continued to work in this country.
There is, don't you think, though, in those questions, kind of a longing for the outsider's perspective Polanski could still bring to America, is there not? I mean, he has a kind of, I don't want to call it cynicism, but we've been trying to describe what it is he has, and that's something that's a light America always needs shown on it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there's a tradition of the outsider showing us what he sees, and it would be wonderful to if he could come here, or even from his base in Paris, do a film that commented on contemporary America. But I think his knowledge of contemporary America is not firsthand, obviously. Right. I mean, he always asks about it. He's up on politics. I've had political discussions with him, and he knows what happens in the States, and but it's not the same thing. So he would be certainly at a disadvantage. But it's a tantalizing thing to think about. Polanski making a film about America the way Antonioni made a film about America in Zabriskie Point.
Right, in a sense, I suppose he did. James Morrison, would you like to hear what Polanski has to say about America today, cinematically?
Very much so. And, of course, his most recently released film was set in America, Carnage. I think that the limitations James speaks of in terms of first-hand knowledge are reflected in the choice of project. A film that doesn't leave a single apartment. Yes. Is one in which you don't have to worry too much that you're not tapped into the zeitgeist, because you're really doing a kind of more insular comedy of manners. But it's beautifully done, in my opinion. I think that if Polanski had stayed in Hollywood, well, we know, of course, that the New Hollywood ended quite unceremoniously. Most of the directors who did gain great prominence in the 1970s weren't doing much by the 80s. Some of the greatest of them went into kind of voice in the wilderness periods. Robert Altman comes to mind in the 1980s, for example, that are, not that different from what you could call a voice in the wilderness period of Polanski in the 1980s, during which decade I think he produced only Pirates and Frantic.
There's something about the 1980s inhospitable to the auteur, especially of Polanski's kind, right?
Very much so. The turn to big budget filmmaking and the turn away from adventurous, small, personal films would not have been, I think, that congenial to Polanski's sensibility. I would have been fascinated to see him do something of that kind. I think he might very well have been interested in doing so when he came to the United States. One might never have thought that he would be making a film version of an extremely popular bestseller like Rosemary's Baby. That wasn't, Rosemary's Baby might not be the first film that comes to mind when you think of the kinds of experimental films of the new Hollywood. For my money, it's one of the greatest, and it does within the parameters of the its sort of generic setting, extraordinary things. I would have loved to see him do an Indiana Jones film.
Oh my!
He's talked about that in an indirect way, something about doing an action film and what he could do with it, and he'll often complain about something he went to see at the theater and it was just noise. And I think Batman, the latest Batman, he was talking about it. He went with his kids, and he just can't stand it. And I think he's thought about that idea about doing an action film, and in some ways, Frantic was a little bit of that, and then it was a kind of a generic American project, and that to some extent, I think he was able to give it the Polanski touch, the flavor of Paris. And the most perverse thing about that movie is, and his goal was to make Paris look unappealing, and he succeeds in it. In the book, I compare it to what Woody Allen did to Manhattan in Manhattan. That the beginning of Manhattan, there's the glorification, the romanticizing of New York. Well, Polanski wouldn't have that. His goal was to kill tourism. He didn't want Americans coming to Paris, and he shows it at its worst. But and I think that's the most intriguing part of that film. And again, I think it's a film that sort of suffers from a story unraveling and running out of steam. How do you feel about Frantic?
I think the first 20 minutes of Frantic are among the best work that he ever did. It's an extraordinary.
In from the airport at the beginning it's a very Polanski setup. Is that not much is happening, but there's that sense that something bad is going to happen. The dread, very still camera, the music, the way it's framed, the lighting. You just know it creates an instant mood that is really a master at work. There's not many directors that could do that with such a shorthand.
Absolutely not. And I think he was depending on this sort of bravura opening set piece to keep the rest of the movie going in a way. On the other hand, he was also, I think, doing something that isn't at all uncharacteristic. The rest of the movie has a quality of inertia about it. And, he's interested in inertia. That isn't, The Ninth Gate, for example, is a kind of experiment in playing off these sort of buoyant, over-the-top set pieces with these very inert kinds of sequences that seem to have a little bit of an Antonioni-like dead time to them. And, I think he really gets into these kinds of counterpointing effects. He mentions, and James' interview material brings this up, Odd Man Out as one of his favorite films. And I can absolutely see that, as remote as it may seem to be from a lot of what seems most central to his work, because the sort of tonal variations in it, from moments of great tension and suspense, and then these kinds of intermediate moments in which nothing much is happening. One could say the same thing of Rosemary's Baby. A lot of horror aficionados think it's not scary enough, and in a way, I suppose it's not, but it's in part because what he wants us to see is this initial horrific event that then shades all of these activities of everyday life. I mean, most of the movie, we're watching Rosemary redecorate her apartment. So I suppose a horror aficionado might be disappointed, but that horror aficionado is missing what is really happening, which is how the worst has already happened, and it is infusing everything we see, so that even if it seems to be very lacking in energy, it still has that undercurrent.
But when it is scary, it is damn scary. And I think that's something that Polanski likes to do, is he really takes his time and builds up to it and makes the tension excruciating. There's that word again. When he was doing Repulsion, there's not a scare in that for the first 50 minutes when Catherine Deneuve opens her closet and the window reflects a man in the mirror, and you jump because this is 50 minutes into the film, and it's slow building the deterioration. And the people who were financing the movie, this company called the Compton Group, better known for doing softcore porn, they were trying to step up the ladder of respectability, but not too far.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So, but they were not happy that. Where are the thrills? Where are the scares? It's they'd see the dailies, and it was 50 minutes into the film, and there wasn't anything yet. And Polanski. Part of it is a perverse pleasure in doing that, but it's his style. He takes his time over. He's not in a hurry to get to point B. He'll guide the audience, and then when you get there, I think it's a bigger punch, a bigger, more emotional. Like, as I would certainly say in Rosemary's Baby, that. Some of the events in there are just pretty startling when they do happen.
Much of what we've said today would seem to, a listener who wasn't that familiar with Polanski might think that he's a director who fit a certain era, and he's still working, but maybe his window of opportunity to really tap into the culture has passed. But James Greenberg, your book is brand new. It's a substantial book. It's a lush book. The book itself, that it's published, and the screenings that have gone on at the Cinematheque indicate that the interest in Polanski has not waned, as it seems to have grown. We can't let listeners think that he's not relevant, can we? Because clearly he's still there. There is, even if his films now are not, if you maybe wouldn't consider them up to his films of the 70s, there's still a current of interest.
I would take issue with the fact that his films aren't up to the films of his earlier films. I think The Pianist is just a brilliant piece of work, and Polanski thinks that's his greatest film. That's the film he wants on his tombstone, and I think it's just an amazing piece of filmmaking. It's kind of the culmination, in a way, of his life's work. It's not my. I love the film and I respect it. It's not just doesn't happen to be maybe it's my second or third favorite of his, but I think it's a remarkable piece of work, and the skill that he's acquired over his career all comes to bear on that film. The attention to detail and creating the setting and the mood and the ability to make it feel real. He was very careful in that film, and it's not shot the way Chinatown and Rosemary's Baby is, with the camera over the shoulder, the subjective camera. He really took a step back in The Pianist, and it's very almost objective. You know, these events are so terrible. Just look at it, and he thought it would be obscene to milk the emotion out of it. Just see what happens, see these events, but I think it's a extraordinary piece of work, and I would say too that The Ghostwriter is a very entertaining and well done thriller, and well worth seeing.
And this is exactly what I want to underscore to listeners who might not know, that this is Roman Polanski is a name from film history, yes, but also a working filmmaker. He may be 80 years old, but I mean, he's not in any sense slowing down. It seems like, I mean, you've had the most recent contact with him. We have not seen the last of Roman Polanski by any means, have we?
By no means. He would he would be the first to say that. He has a film coming out. It was played at Cannes, called Venus in Fur. It's a two-hander based on the play that was on Broadway. It's about a director casting a play and about masochism, and his wife plays the lead female role, and it's kind of a kinky, mysterious, sexy comedy in a way, and that should be coming our way in the next few months, or certainly by the spring. He's trying to put together a project to do his version of the Dreyfus Affair, a period piece in France. He does not seem like an 80-year-old person. When I went to see him in last summer, I hadn't seen him in about 4 or 5 years, and he looked exactly the same. He's a wonder of science or genetics or what have you, or will. I think he just wills himself. He's a person of incredible will to have survived some of the events of his life, and he's trim, he's fit, he's got a full head of hair. He does not look or seem like a person who's 80. And I asked him, why do you continue to work? And he said, well, I'm still learning. It's still fascinating. I love it. This is what I wanted to do. This is what I've always wanted to do. And I'm going to continue to do. And, there's no reason for him to stop. It's still, and I think he's happiest when he's on the set of a movie. I think, he said that, and he told me that that's where he loves to be.
And James Morrison, in the years since your book on Polanski has come out, what would you add to what you said about him then? But he's made more than a couple movies since your book, right? It's only been a few years, but he's put things out.
He since my book came out in 2007, and he has released 2 films since then: The Ghostwriter,
not more than a couple.
The Ghostwriter and Carnage, both of which I admire greatly. And in my book, I do talk about the phases of his career, and I argue that it's really only Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown that you could argue are films that provided him with essentially unlimited resources in a way. But what does that mean anyway? I mean, I think in terms of thinking about film, it's always a complicated thing. His films of the 60s discover great bounty in their constraints. You know, they're essentially low budget. They're sort of like B movies in a way, but so were Fritz Lang's films of the 50s and Orson Welles. And those served, I think, as the models of Polanski's earliest films. How do you, do amazing things with limited resources? In a way, after his Hollywood career, he may have occasionally found himself once again working with limited resources. But those early films are the ones that really articulate the sensibility that we're talking about. And there is about it a quality of modesty. You know, it's why it's a little hard to imagine an Indiana Jones, Roman Polanski film or a kind of, big budget. You know, when he makes the film about the Dreyfus Affair, it's not going to be like Les Miserables. You know, it's going to do something else. So there's always, I think, a certain resistance to thinking that if you have, some version of unlimited resources, you're suddenly a great filmmaker, you know? Yes. And Polanski is never a filmmaker whom one would look to tap into the zeitgeist, really. Although there are topical reference points in most of his movies, it's his sensibility that is contemporary. And I think that that's what makes his films of the New Hollywood more lasting in appeal, probably, than, say, Medium Cool, or some very, very topical film of the New Hollywood. They were all over the place in the New Hollywood. But their sensibilities don't remain contemporary in the way that Polanski's does.
I think that's true. I think the foundation of Polanski's films are more philosophical, deeper, broader than the political events that may have inspired other films. And that's why they feel fresher. They're not period pieces when you go back and see them. I would comment on your point about working with limited resources in his earlier films. He bemoans that, but when we were talking about Repulsion, which he did with very on a shoestring and did some very innovative things just out of necessity, and that's where filmmakers, the Fritz Lang you mentioned, really their solution to problems is what's amazing, and I think he did that quite well in Repulsion. But when we were talking about it, he said, well, I'm not really happy with it. It's, we didn't have enough money, we didn't have enough time, and the effects, the hands coming through the wall and the walls cracking, all of that stuff. God, I could have done it so much better with the resources now with CGI, and I think it's really a shabby piece of work. And yes, that was my reaction. I said, one of these great films of paranoia, and I said, well, you mean shabby effective or just shabby? So he said, well, I didn't expect it to be as successful as it was, so I guess I'd have to say shabby but effective.
Sometimes, that's what you can hope for, but shabby but effective, I think we would all agree that there's each and every one of Roman Polanski's films exceeds that description in its own way. Even a one like The Ninth Gate, which, as I said, was still the first one I saw theatrically. So, I've got a place for it. In any case, I've been speaking today at LARB HQ about the works of filmmaker Roman Polanski with two authorities on the subject: James Morrison, memoirist and novelist, author of the contemporary film directors series book on Roman Polanski, and James Greenberg, author of the brand new Roman Polanski, a retrospective. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. You can find more from me at colinmarshall.org and more from the LARB at lareviewofbooks.org. Thanks.